Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see you. It's wonderful to be here. Let me turn this on. Be here with you and to conclude this month's discussion of the kind of people that God uses. I'd like to say, first of all, this will be my last Sunday in July. I'll come back again in August, the last couple of weeks in August. But between now and then, let me say to you how flattered and honored I've been to be invited here to help transition this congregation from one preacher to another one. And I hope that Brother Adams will be the person that you're looking for and that works out for you. And in the meantime, I'll be keeping you in my prayers that goes well. And that turns out to be a good working relationship for both you and him. Now, somebody has said that the purpose of Christianity is to help a man deal with his conscience and his Bible. And that's a pretty succinct way of saying what I'm going to say in a more complicated way here in just a second. And that is that one of the difficulties that we have as Christians is coming to grips and getting our mind around the idea that on one hand, God is God, but on the other hand, we with all of our inconsistencies, and we run hot, we run cold, we're up, we're down, and yet at the same time, He uses us to show forth the excellencies of Him who called us. And how He can do that is one of the difficult things, is one of the challenges of Christianity. We've all seen Christians fall away, right? Some of it is explained by, there's a gospel meeting, and there's a big push, and there's an impulse, and somebody gets excited, and they acted, and then it kind of wears off, and it happens, right? Sometimes a situation takes place where a person becomes a Christian, but then things get in the way. Life gets busy, there's work, there's careers, there's a family, and other things, and so they just kind of drift away, and that happens as well. Others, on the other hand, they just love sin, and they just could not turn loose of a practice that they had, and so they're no longer with us. But it happens where you see people who start, and then they stop. They start, and then they give up. Now, why does it happen? Why does it happen so often? Is what I hope we can get our minds around this evening. Partly is because we haven't given adequate instruction on how it is that God can be God, and He can still relate to us with all of our inconsistencies and all of our ups and downs. And so today I want to talk about the kind of people that God uses. And the kind of people that God uses, it's real simple. God uses flawed people. He uses people who make mistakes. And they say the wrong thing, and they do the wrong thing, and they say it again, they do the wrong thing again, and they're inadequate, and they're imperfect. And it happens over and over again, and yet God is still God, and we're still His servants. Let me give you a couple of examples. Start with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. You remember Abraham? Chapter 12 is he's the father of the faithful. He's the friend of God. He's called the father of them that believe. And in Genesis chapter 12, and verse 1, this is the first exchange between God and Abraham. And to show you how important he was, over in John chapter 8, you don't have to turn there, but you might jot it down. Over in John chapter 8, Jesus is challenging the religious leaders, and they came back and they said, we have Abraham as our father. They wanted to be connected to him. He's one of the most respected names in Israel, along with Moses and Elijah. Here's Genesis chapter 12. Now the Lord had said unto Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred, from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Here's my point. God's men of faith are not always full of faith. God's men of faith are not always perfect. God's men of faith sometimes make mistakes. But here's my next point. God knows everything, right? And everything He knows right now. That there's no future knowledge with Him. There's no past knowledge with Him. He is the all-knower. He knows it now. Has it ever occurred to you that nothing ever occurs to Him? He knows it already, right? He is the all-knower. Did he know Abraham at the very beginning? Yes. And yet he still said that Abraham will become the father of a great nation. Abraham is respected more by religious people. He's respected by the Islam community. He's respected by the Jewish community. And he's respected by the Christian community. But a curious incident happens in chapter 12 and verse 10. Famine in the land, and Abraham goes down into Egypt to survive the famine. Verse 11, it says, "And it came to pass when he was come near to enter into Egypt, that he said unto Sarai his wife, Behold, now I know that thou art a fair woman to look upon. Therefore it shall come to pass, when the Egyptians shall see thee, that thou shalt say, This is his wife. They shall say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will save thee alive. Say, I pray thee, that thou art my sister, that it may be well with me for thy sake, and my soul shall live because of thee." So what's Abraham doing right now? What's happening? Number one, he's lying. You say, well, yeah, but there's this other verse that says that she was his half-sister. She was his half-sister, but he's saying that she's my sister here in order to conceal the fact he's also married to her. Number one, he's lying. Number two, he's getting Sarah, the mother of the promised nation, to lie. He's using his wife to protect his own hide. Time out. How many of you remember, like, the late 1980s, early 1990s? Do you remember when Desert Storm went down? You remember when Saddam Hussein knew that, the world was about to blow his world up, and so he started grabbing hostages? You remember this incident? He took a British family hostage, put him in the palace, and then he'd have press conferences showing that little 8-year-old boy on his lap, and you could see the look on that boy's face. He was in utter fear. But what was he doing? He was protecting himself at the expense of that family. He was hiding under that family's skirts. What's Abraham doing? He's protecting his own self at the expense of his wife. Keep going in verse 14. "And it came to pass that when Abraham came into Egypt, the Egyptians beheld the woman, that she was very fair." Sarah must have been a knockout. She must have been just a doll. "She was very fair, and the princess also of Pharaoh saw her, committed her before Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house." Now, Sarah must have been something to see, but at the same time, don't miss this point. Pharaoh's not taking her to add her to his sewing circle. He's taking her to be part of his harem. That's what he's after. Now, did it happen? As far as Abraham is concerned and the decisions he's made, if it didn't happen, it could have happened. But as far as the Bible is concerned, the Bible is silent. But here's the point. God's people are not always perfect. And God, knowing that Abraham was going to do before it happened, he still chose Abraham to become the father of the faithful. Why does God use a man like Abraham? Why does he use a man who's going to hide behind his wife's skirts? Why does he use someone like that who's going to lie? And the answer is this: because God uses flawed people. He uses people like Abraham to show forth the excellencies of him who called him. Page forward to Genesis chapter 15 and 16. The promise that God has given to Abraham doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. It keeps on not happening. Sarah and Abraham get frustrated. They get aggravated. And so Sarah takes matters into her own hands, and she says, okay, if this is not going to happen through me because I'm advanced in years, then it's going to happen through my handmaid Hagar. She sends Hagar into Abraham. What's wrong with that? Hagar is not his wife. Abraham's married to Sarah. People who make mistakes. Is it okay to lie? No. Is it okay to intervene in God's plans and substitute your plan for his plan? No. If you look at Genesis chapter 16 and 16 and chapter 17, the last verse of chapter 16, the first verse of 17, there's a 13-year period of silence between Abraham and God. You got a good friend that you don't speak to for 13 years, you begin to say, hey, there's something wrong here. There were consequences to sin. It has its punishment. It's going to be in the cross, but it also has a consequence in this life. The wise man says the way of the transgressor is hard. Go from there to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11. In Acts chapter 13, David is called a man after God's own heart. Remember the principle. God knows everything, and everything He knows it right now. He's the all-knower. Remember, 1 Samuel chapter 16, David is God's own choice. You remember that? He brought the household of Jesse in front of Samuel. Is it this one? No. Is it this one? No. God doesn't look on the outside. He looks on the inside. And then there was David, and God chose David. David was God's choice, and God makes no mistakes. Did God know about David? When God chose David in 1 Samuel chapter 16, did He know that the David of 1 Samuel 16 would be the David of 2 Samuel chapter 11? He knows those things. What kind of people does He use? He uses the only kind that He has available to Him. Is it okay to take another man's wife? No, no, no. That's 2 Samuel chapter 11. It reads like this. It came to pass after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel, and they destroyed the children of Ammon, and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem. And it came to pass in an eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her, and she came unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. And the woman conceived and sent and told David, and said, "I am with child." And that gives way to that famous chapter, one chapter over, when Nathan, you remember the prophet? He comes in and he delivers the most difficult sermon that could ever be delivered, where he tells the story and he looks at David the king and says, "David, you are that man. You're the sinner that God's talking about." But prior to 1 Samuel chapter 12, there was the deed of 1 Samuel chapter 11, but now you got the cover-up. There's the cover-up. The cover-up's worse than the deed. David's got to cover this thing somehow, so here's what he does. He sends a message to his general Joab out on the battlefield, and he says, "Send me Bathsheba's husband, Uriah." He brings Uriah in, interviews him. How's the battle going? How's Joab the general? How does the whole army fare? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a couple of days off. I'm going to send some food down to you. Go into your wife. Enjoy yourself. Uriah exits from there, and Uriah has more honor than David does because Uriah refuses to go back to his home. He goes out and spends the night with the servants. David brings him in the next day. "I sent you home. How come you didn't go home?" He said, "How can I enjoy the pleasure of the household when the Ark of the Covenant is out on the battlefield? The armies of Israel are sleeping in tents. My general is out there." Uriah had more honor than David did. David says, "Okay, hang around for a little while. I want to throw you a dinner." Throws him a dinner, gets him drunk. But Uriah drunk has more honor than David has sober. He refuses to go back home. So David sits down, and he writes out an important dispatch. And he sends it to Joab. He says, "Joab, I want you to place Uriah the Hittite in the hottest part of the battle. When the battle is at its hottest part, I want you to give the signal to everyone withdraw away from Uriah so that he's killed in the battlefield." Signs it, seals it, ties it up. And guess who he hands it to? He hands it to Uriah the Hittite. He hands it to Uriah the Hittite knowing that Uriah has too much honor as he delivers this dispatch to Joab to stop along the way and open it up and see what it says. And wouldn't you like to have been Joab when Joab receives that message and he opens it up and there's Uriah standing in front of him having made that trip, and he reads, place Uriah in the point of battle so that he loses his life. How would you like to see the look on Joab's face? On the other hand, he's cold-blooded, right? He might have had a perfect poker face. So Joab stages the battle and Uriah loses his life. So here's David. Adulterer, liar, hypocrite, gets a soldier drunk, high-handed abuse of authority, gets soldiers killed, and a man after God's own heart. How do you explain that? And the way you explain it is by recognizing that God uses flawed people. He uses those who make mistakes. Take a look at Peter. These references are taken from Matthew chapter 26. Peter is the apostle. There's 4 lists of apostles in the Gospels, and Peter heads the list of each one. Peter's a leader. He's the only one who rebuked the Lord. He's the only one who walked on water. And before you're too hard on Peter, because Peter walked on water and sank, you remember? Where were the other apostles? How come they didn't join him? At least Peter had enough faith to get out and take a few steps, right? Not to be too hard on Peter. But in Matthew chapter 26, Jesus has gathered the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he makes the announcement that he's going to Jerusalem, he's going to be betrayed, and you guys are going to deny me. And Peter speaks up in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 33, and Peter means this. You're not just being a loudmouth. He says, if everybody denies you, I'll never deny you. These guys might, yeah. Me, no. And Jesus stopped and said, Peter, before morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. Judas shows up, betrays Jesus with a kiss. Judas shows up with the Roman soldiers, you remember, in what has to be a bureaucratic overkill. I mean, there's a country preacher out there, and they come after him like he's some kind of an outlaw. He's betrayed by Judas. He's arrested, taken in for a mock trial. Luke records the fact that Peter followed afar off. And he uses that expression, followed afar off. That's not by accident, because what Peter wants to do is Peter wants to make sure that he can stay far enough away so the trouble breaks out, he can get away. But he also wants to stay close enough in case something really good happens, like the kingdom occurs, he'll be close enough to join in. He followed afar off. And in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 69, it says, now Peter was sitting without in the court, and a maid came up to him, saying, thou also was with Jesus the Galilean. But he denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. Now, the commentaries say that the word maiden here in verse 69 is a word that means a girl. It's not a Roman soldier. It's not a waterboard team. It's not an interrogation room. It's a 12 to 13-year-old girl. Like a 7th grader. A 7th grade girl brings more pressure on Peter. He says, I don't know what you're talking about. Look at the next verse. Verse 72. And when he was gone out in the porch, another maid saw him, and saith unto him that were there, this man also was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath, I know not the man. I promise I don't know who that is. A couple of 7th grade girls come up and bring enough peer pressure to cause Peter to fold up like a cheap card table. Look at the next verse. And after a little while they stood by and came and said to Peter, of a truth thou art one of them, for thy speech maketh thee known. Then began he to curse and to swear, I know not. Here comes the curses. I know not the man. And straightway the cock crew. Now, Luke records at that precise moment that Peter denied him that 3rd time, just like Jesus said he would, that Jesus turned and looked at Peter. Can you imagine what that gaze was all about when they met eyes? But here's Peter. The same Peter who said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." The same Peter who said, "I'll never deny you. These guys might, but I never will." What kind of people does God use to show forth His excellencies? He uses the only kind that He has available. Here's the application. 1 Timothy chapter 3 speaks about the wiles of the devil. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 speaks about the devil's devices, and we're not to be ignorant of them. Peter says that the devil walks about like a roaring lion. Revelation 12 verse 9 says that the devil is the deceiver of the whole world. Does he want to deceive you? Yes. Does he want you to know that you're being deceived? No. Here's the application. If we're honest, we would admit that there have been times this week, or maybe not too far past, where we haven't done so well with this Christianity business. Said things, done things, didn't say things, didn't do things. And if we could plug a cable into our head and project that on the screen, we would see things that all of us would be embarrassed by, right? What we have to be careful about is the devil with his devices, with his wiles, with his deceptions, that he will use that against us to strip us of any kind of good, decent impulse to do service to the Lord. And he'll say things like, "How dare you circulate amongst those people after you did what you did?" And he'll use that against us to make sure that the service to the Lord doesn't happen. There are 2 points. Number one, the one who knows you the best also loves you the most. Who knows you the best? The good Lord, right? And He knows who you are. He knows how you are. He knows what sins you've committed. He knows what sins you will commit. He knows what sins you're committing now. And yet the God who knows you the best still sent His Son to die on a cross on our behalf. Number 2, there is no one who has not failed. There is no one who has never been perfect. Anyone who's saved is going to be saved in spite of the fact that they have sinned, and only sinners, only the flawed, are going to be saved. Now, there are days when I get up in the morning, and I mean, I'm rested, and I'm fresh, and the coffee's hot, and the day goes well, and I'm in a good mood, and I'm saying hello to everybody, and even I feel like praying. But there are other days when I get up and I felt like I hadn't slept at all, and I'm tired, and I'm short. Coffee's not any good, and when I talk to somebody, I may be short and curt with them. Now, if you ask me which one is the real me, the answer is neither one. The real me is somewhere in between those two extremes. Question: do you know of any scripture that says that heaven is more pleased with me or with us on our good days and depressed with us on our bad days? Because heaven knows if I'm up today, I'm going to be down in a couple of weeks. And He knows if I'm down today, it's going to be a few days before I'm up. Do you know of any scripture that suggests that God judges us by one isolated act that occurs on one single isolated day? How can God use a person like Abraham? How can God use a person like David, a person like Peter, or people like women who Jesus had preached to and said, in 3 days I'm going to be raised from the dead, and 3 days later they're on their way to the cemetery. They're not going there to meet a resurrected Lord. They're going to anoint a dead body. How can God use somebody like that? If it's not because God is able to look at the overall direction of our life, He knows everything about us. He knows before it happens, and He knows when we're up, we're soon going to be down, and when we're down, we're soon going to be up. And not one isolated incident of faithfulness, fidelity, or weakness determines the judgment. Oh, that's for sure. We can do something for so long with such repetitiveness that becomes who we are, and that's what we are, and that describes us, and we can miss heaven. But let's suppose for a second that I say something like this. I say, blah, 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 blah. And you hear that, and you go to somebody who knows me really well, and you say, man, did you hear what Chris said? No. What did he say? He said blah, 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 blah. And the person who knows me well says, Chris said that? Yeah, I was standing there when blah, 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 blah. That doesn't sound like Chris. I've known him for a long time. I've never heard him say stuff like that. Something must be bothering him for him to sound like that. And you know what's happening? That individual is rendering a judgment not based on one isolated moment of frustration, but based upon a long drawn out relationship where he's seen good, bad, ugly, otherwise, and he knows me. And making a decision based upon a span of years. If our hope is no more grounded, if our hope is no stronger than what can be jeopardized by an isolated moment of frustration or aggravation or weakness, tell me, what is the meaning of the power of God unto salvation? What's the meaning of the power of the cross? That heaven is able to look at our lives, the overall flow, the overall direction, the goodness and the badness, the weakness and the strength, the fidelity and the infidelity, and know exactly who we are. Not overly excited when we're faithful, not overly depressed when we're not. Now, you can let sin rule over you. Don't mishear. Don't hear something I didn't say. You can let sin rule over you, and you can miss heaven. Let's suppose this. Let's suppose because I knew that. Let's suppose you knew that your wife would forgive you. Would it be okay just to reach out and just slap her? If you knew she'd forgive you, would it be okay to do that? The answer is 1,000 times no. Number one, she'd probably hit you back. But would it ruin an otherwise happy marriage if you just went and smacked? Oh, it'd strain it, wouldn't it? Would she cry? She'd cry. Would it break her heart? It'd break her heart in two. But would it be okay, just because you knew that she would forgive you, just to come out and smack? It's not okay to sin. It's not all right to slap God in the face. David's family fell apart. I mean, his daughter was abused by his sons. His sons tried to kill him. Sin has its consequences. But what I'm trying to say in this convoluted manner is God uses people like you and me. Don't give up. Don't give up on yourself. He uses people like you and me to show forth the excellencies of His calling. Because in the Christian race, it's not those who finish first that win. It's not those who know the most verses in the Bible that win. It's not those who have the most. The ones who finish are the ones who win. The ones who win are those who never, never, never give up. story came out of the Special Olympics a few years back, in which there were a bunch of kids who were placed on a track, and they were prepared to run a 440. This is a race for challenged children. The race started, and there's a pack of them, 7 or 8 of them, took off, and there was one little boy that took the lead, and he jumped way out there in front of everybody, running as fast as he could run. He got about 150 yards from the finish line, and guess what happened? He ran out of gas, and then he fell. And everybody in the stands was saying, "Get up, get up, get up, get up." And he sat there and he just bawled and squalled and just cried. Well, he stayed there long enough for the rest of the pack to catch up with him. And once they got to him, everybody stopped, congregated, had a conversation, and then everybody picked him up. They locked arms, and they finished the race together. The announcer didn't know it, but he preached the gospel when he said, "In this race, all who finish win." Ladies and gentlemen, hang in there. Hang in there. Our God is big enough to use people like you and me. And what a God we have. We're going to sing an invitation song at this time. And if you're here this evening and you feel the need to respond in a public manner, while together we stand and sing, "Won't you come right now?"
Let us rise up and build in the name